So this year I wanted to do something for Halloween, and I knew I was going to be traveling mid-October, and things were going to be going crazy with us having a release schedule at work at the end of the month. So I wanted to put something together in the challenge style that I've been doing, where I try to do something in 5 days, just like I encourage my students to do, just to get some practice in with building environments inside of Unreal Engine. And so I settled on this graveyard scene here. Now, I had gathered up some reference images here that I just found online, something that I wanted to put forth to inspire me a little bit. And I had these three here, and there were elements from each of the three, but you can definitely see how in this one down here, I'm really focusing on trying to create that a little bit of a path going on. That was huge inspiration there. And then in this one, of course, my two hero tombstones are very inspired by this one right here and this one right here. And so we come back over here and we can see the path and we can see my two hero tombstones here. So let's go ahead and jump over into Unreal and have a look at this scene. So here in Unreal, we can see from my camera point of view, right here, completely unedited, this is what we see in Editor. Now, if I pop out of my cinematic camera here, we can see the actual scene itself, where in this, we can actually fly around and you can see all of the stuff in here. I can fly through here, and this path actually goes a little ways. And I have a little bit of the graveyard built out. It's mostly focused on the areas that you can see from the camera, but I did want to fill it out just so I had the feeling of a full graveyard here. And I had a little bit more freedom to play around with my camera. And of course, I can drop in here and play, and we can actually run around through it too. Now, of course, this is a little heavy right here because I have everything set to a more cinematic experience for the actual image rendering that I've done, but I could tune this down to be optimized for gameplay. Now, what is this scene made up with? Well, of course, we have this landscape here. We have some foliage on the landscape. Now, beyond that, the main things we've got are these trees right here that I've put together that were kind of repurposed from an old asset that I had. And then I have the tombstones, which I'd put together, which are all custom modeled and everything. And then, of course, we're using, the occasional Megascans asset along with a bunch of Megascans textures, such as what you see on the landscape here. And then, of course, over here on the right, you can see my Light Studio by Digital Alchemy here, a tool that I put together to help me with doing things like lighting scenes, tuning textures with my neutral light map. And then, of course, I do have my scale references in here, which I can do some really cool things with, from changing the body type on the fly to the material type, colors, all of that stuff, turning shadows on and off with this. But this is just a little tool that I have put together to help myself, and I also give it to my students over at my Learn Digital Alchemy courses. Okay, so now let's have a look at what we're putting together with this. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to go to my graveyard gem level. I'm not going to save that. And in this, we can see what I've got here to throw this together. So we've got the trees over here, which were just pulled from an old asset as a starting point, as a base that I went in and I did some changes to. I did some modifications to, made them nanite, created a material for them using Megascans textures. Speaking of Megascans, we also have over here just a few Megascans that we're using, such as these two rocks here. We got a couple of logs and we got some small rocks here. And then, of course, there's all the materials that I'm using, and we'll look at those later. But then we have the tombstones here, which these were ones that I custom modeled, put them together. I've got these two hero pieces here that are sharing a UV space. And then the base here, along with all of these small tombstones, are all sharing a UV space. So between the base color, the normal map, and the masks, we're only using a total of 6 textures, so 2 material instances here. Now, how I've put these together, something else on here is if we look over here on this, we can see some crunchiness going on. This is actually a detail normal that I added to this that originally I had tiling a little bit more. But with that, I wasn't getting what I needed from the scene. So if I look at the actual material instance over here, initially what I'd set this to was, I think, like 4. Yeah, so something a little closer to that, something a little closer to, 5, I think. Whereas when you're out here, it looked fine for that. But then in my nighttime scene, I just wasn't getting what I needed to pop out, at least from the distance that I was looking at. So brought that down to a lower tiling rate so you can see the normals a little bit further away. I've got some other things going on in here inside of the material, which is actually pretty messy right now. I haven't cleaned it up yet. I am definitely going to be cleaning this material up a little bit more before I offer this project to download to my students over at Learn Digital Alchemy. But in this, you can see that I've got my normal map here, and I'm blending with this blend angle corrected normals. I'm blending the micro normals onto this, but I'm also blending the base color from that same material onto the main base color here with a soft light blend. Got some contrast ability with the actual base color here. And then I've got some grunge that I'm pumping into this using a noise mask here, and then an actual grunge color, and that's all able to tile separately from everything else. That comes in here, and then we have a little bit of an albedo boost that I can use to control the overall brightness of my base color texture, which is really useful when you're working with lighting and you need to grab a little bit more bounce light off of it. Doing a nighttime scene, I did have to take this to a point where I was bumping it up a little bit more, so about 25%, to make sure that I was getting enough that was bouncing around. But then beyond those, the other cool thing about these is you can see that it has this text on it here, which is something that I had added in the blueprint of this, which is a lot easier to see when it's more of a nighttime kind of scene. So if I pump this up a little bit, originally I had this text a little bit darker, but in my nighttime scene, it was reading as black. So I brought the color of the text a little bit closer to the color of the actual tombstone, which you can see in the darkness reads a little bit better. So how I'm doing this is in the actual blueprint, I have this struct that I had put together, which has a prefix, this right here, a name, this right here, and then a birth date and a death date. And I can come in here and say, we'll say remembering, and then we'll say Jackson Lee, and then we'll say we were born in February of 1942 and we died in October of 1957. So it wasn't a very long life there, but this makes it really easy to go in and change the text on all of my tombstones on a per instance basis. So this way I could have a bunch of tombstones. They all have different things on there. Now this is just through a struct. So if I go into my actual blueprint here, I do have a struct down here for tombstone text, which you can see the properties over there. And we're just in here pretty much building these strings to feed into the 3D text right here, which of course, these being on many different sizes of these, because I also have a version selector here that allows you to change which tombstone you're actually using. I did have to set it up where I could modify the location of this text, but this text basically rests right here on the mesh itself. And you can see a little bit of normal mapping in there, and that was actually fairly easy to set up. So what I did for that was I created a font material, which is just a default lit masked material here. Reading in a text color, it's got a pretty high roughness on here, but then we have our actual font, which is just the Roboto distance field. It's a default one that gets used inside of Unreal here. We're running it through our lerp of -90 and 90. And what this does is it basically masks out the text. If you use just any regular text renderer inside of a blueprint, it's going to have its own version of this material. But then what I'm doing is I'm taking this and I am reversing it. So 1-, feeding that into this height to normal smooth node, which ends up creating a normal map based off of that. So really simple setup that gets you a very simple normal map, which does just work in this particular situation. You turn my game settings back on there. And then if I were to fly back over to my graveyard scene, you can see how in this lighting setup, it reads a lot better. So like I said, I originally had it darker on the text, but then this was what worked for this particular scene. So next up, how do we put this together? Well, let's go ahead and break this down. I'm going to actually start turning off all the stuff in here. We'll leave that one on. I'll turn that off, and then we'll turn that off. And what I've got here is this landscape. So I started with the landscape. Let me go ahead and turn this to -1 here. No, it's too much. 0. Yeah, leave that at 1. You can see a little bit better here. Okay, so I did have this landscape. Let me turn off my grass here. I'm going to come to show. We're going to come down to advanced, and I'm going to pop over and uncheck grass so we can't see the grass maps. So basically, I started with this landscape. It's not a very big landscape here. And then I came in here and I sculpted this path on it. Now, with this particular path, Essentially, what I had done was I came through here, I drew out the path with my paint layers. So I'd already created my material at this point. I knew what material layers I was going to use. And then after I had done that, I just kind of hand drew this path. I could have done it more procedurally, yes, with an auto material using the pathing tool, but I wanted to just get kind of a hand touch on this. Also, I wanted to be able to dive right in. I didn't want to set up any of that other stuff. So I had this here, sculpted my path on here, and then I created a material with this where I use those Megascans textures for the layers. So if I come into this right here, I'm going to go ahead and go into my landscape material. Essentially what I did was to create this landscape layer blend right here. I had it divided up into these layers using the set material attributes. And these are just Megascans textures here. That I do have a global tiling coming from over here. So it's the same tiling rate for all of these textures. And then after that, what I did was I needed to solve the issue with landscapes having too much specular value in the distance. And so I did a little trick through here where we just take the roughness of our landscape layer. We are doing an invert on it with the 1- node, feeding that through a power and multiplying it by a maximum specular value. But the main node here is this edge specular contrast that feeds into this power node. This is the parameter that basically controls how the specular reacts out in the world. So if I go over here to my instance and let's go ahead and turn the game settings back on, we're going to come back over to my nighttime here. And with this edge specular, you can see if I take it down, we start to get less spec going on. I take it up, we get much less spec over here at the front. So I usually keep it right around 0.8 so that it gets just enough specular coming off of that roughness map. But then, of course, beyond that, we also have the grass maps that we had set up for this, where I just have a simple grass map setup, and I have it on my mossy ground layer, but I am excluding my path and my soil layers. Now, these layers right here, if I were to go into my landscape and I go to my paint mode, you'll see I have soil, mulch, mossy ground, and path. And then I have the soil and path, the two layers that are really defining this walking path through here. And so I want to make sure I didn't have any of that grass seeping over onto it, but it's this mossy ground layer that drives my grass maps in this. And so if I come back over here to show advanced, I'll turn my grass on, and we can see how that grass builds up on that mossy ground layer there. But then, of course, something else that you might notice about this is that these textures on here, on this landscape, they look pretty detailed, and that's because I am using displacement on these. So this displacement, it allows things from coming from the height map to be able to push out a little bit more. So it actually displaces the mesh itself. And of course, this is something that if you get all the way down here, it does look really crunchy, does not look very good at all. But if you get up here and you're looking down, you can see how good that starts to look. All of this detail is coming from that displacement there. And so if I come in here to my landscape material, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for tessellation. I'm going to turn it off. I'm going to apply real quick. And now you can see what it looks like without displacement. So if I were to go into my Cine camera actor right here, you can see that that ground through there just does not look as interesting. It looks really, really flat, and the specular is going completely crazy. But if I come back over here and I enable this back, we can see that extra detail that comes in, and it just makes such a huge difference, especially on landscapes. Now, of course, to get this working, it's not just a checkbox right now. I'm here in 5.4. You do have to do a little bit of work that involves editing an INI file. So what we do for that is we go into our project folder here. We're going to go into the config, and you're going to find this default engine INI right here. And when you open that up, what you want to do is you're going to come down here to the render settings, and you need to add these two lines right here. The r.nanite.allow tessellation equals 1 and the r.nanite tessellation equal 1. Once you add those to your INI, you can restart the engine, and from there, you will have the ability to turn displacement on. Now, how you do that is you go into your material. The first thing you want to do is you want to search for tessellation, and you turn enable tessellation on. And then you can search for displacement, and you're going to see your displacement values here, where the magnitude is going to control how much is displaced. Now, something like the landscape here, I had to drop that down to 0.25. The default, I believe, is 4.0, which if I were to leave it at that, you can see it gets super crazy, and that is definitely not what I want. So the 0.25 made it something that I can work with. Now, the other important thing here is that this only works on a nanite mesh. So you do have to enable nanite for your landscape, which is easy enough. You just select your landscape here and you can search nanite, and there is an enable nanite option here. You'll have to check that. And then, of course, I do believe you have to rebuild your data. After you do that, it'll actually pop up here, right here. One landscape actor with physical materials needs to be rebuilt. So you will have to do that to get it working. But then you'll be able to use displacement on your landscape materials here. So I'll go ahead and hit this rebuild, and you can see that happened pretty fast. All right, now, so this in here, after my landscape, I had my tombstones and my trees. So if I come over here and I turn my tombstones on, we can see the tombstones that I have laid out through here. Got quite a few in here, but I did initially start with a very simple setup, which we look at this here. Yeah, my initial setup, I had a little bit sculpted onto the landscape. I had my scale references here. I had just a few tombstones, and I had my main trees that I was going to be dealing with. And then I set up my camera composition and kind of an idea of where I wanted it to be. And then from here, we ended up with this layout with the tombstones. And then, of course, I had my hand-placed trees. Now, these are my hero trees here. So I had some that I knew I wanted to be in very specific spots in relation to the camera. I knew I wanted to have these two back here, which were kind of shaping the path, kind of arching away through the path here. I had this particular one, which was actually the initial hero one right here. And then the secondary hero was this one right here. And so these were laid out at certain points that worked with the composition for me. Later on, I actually added this one, and the last one that I added was actually this one right here, which was right up here at the front. And the reason that I added this one in particular is because I wanted to get this framing right here in my composition. So you can see this kind of arched framing through here. So it was just something to make the image a little bit more interesting overall. And then, of course, beyond this, I did have my hand-placed megascans, which were just put through here. I had this fallen log, and I had another rotten log over here somewhere. I had these rocks that I put through here. I didn't really have a whole lot going on with the megascans. It wasn't a huge amount of things that the scene relied on. They were just basic extra set dressing that I had going on. And then, of course, we had the forest in the back. So there's a big open space back here, and I want to have a forest back there. And that is where I use the foliage tool for it, which if I turn that on, you can see all of these back through here. Now, another thing that I used the foliage tool for was with my grass through here, there were just spots that were kind of barren. And the reason these particular spots were barren was because as I was painting my layers, even with the subtraction methodology for the grass maps in my landscape material here, there were still instances where I was getting some grass that was encroaching into the middle here, and it just really wasn't working out for me. And I think that had to do with the lower resolution of the landscape that I was actually using. And so with the foliage tool, I was able to actually push back on my painting layers a little bit. So it really pushed that grass to the side and then used the foliage tool to fill in those areas a little bit more. Now, another thing that I added in here, which was actually the very last thing that I added, and it was based off of a recommendation from a coworker. I thought I had finished this scene. I was trying to get it out the door. I was running out of time. I was like, I got to get this out there. But then, of course, this particular coworker was like, it'd be really cool if you had some dead leaves. In which case I was like, oh no, now I have to go add dead leaves because the idea is in my head. So my dead leaves through here, we've got these here. Now I struggled to find a method to get these in here at first. The first thing I did was I went to the marketplace. I'm like, are there any like leaf meshes or anything like that I can use to get this in here? Because I don't have time to make a solution myself because I really was running out of time. But then I remembered, hey, I could probably do something with displacement. So what I did was I found a material on Pixel Megascans where we had, let's see this here. I'll open up this. So I found this this material on Quixel Megascans, and I'm like, I wonder if it has a good displacement map. And so that's one of the great things about using Megascans too, is that they usually come with this map called ORDP, where the DP in the blue channel stands for displacement. So this did have a displacement map in here. Perfect. So what I ended up doing was I put together this really simple material. You can see my texture samples up here, where I'm using world-aligned textures, so I don't have to deal with UVs or anything like that. And I am feeding this in here and taking advantage of the blue channel of this, the displacement map, and feeding that into this displacement material, which, yes, I also did have to come in here and enable tessellation. And on this one, I had to set my magnitude to 20, much higher than I did on the landscape, so that I got enough going on through here so that it actually raised up. And then I had to get some planes that I'd actually copied over from the engine library, so just this plane and this sphere as well, so that I could enable nanite on these. Once I enabled nanite on them, I was able to apply this material, and if I alt drag a copy of this up, you can see that this material has some nice displaced detail with these leaves. Of course, just like any tessellated material, you get up on here and it looks really crunchy and looks really bad. But if you're looking at it from the right angle, it looks really good and is really powerful. So what I did was I just used a world-aligned texture so I could use a bunch of these and just start to lay them out on here to get these leaves on the ground. And of course, these, you can see I can push down into the ground to get some of them showing through. So it's not just a flat plane that's floating out there. So I tried to blend them as much as possible. This one I think was my favorite, turned out the best. This is just a plane put back into place, sinks down into the ground. I can move it up and down. You can see how you shape it the right way. And if it works with how you got your landscape set up, perfect, just golden. So I came through here and I added all of these in here. And of course, I added a bunch through here where we've got these trees back here, and that gives something in the distance to show off. You can see back over there, but I did definitely want to have plenty up here up front, so I captured all of that detail on there. So of course, that's how we set this up, but the big question and what everybody has been waiting for in this video is, how do we set up an actual night scene? How do we do the night lighting for something like this? Well, generally, what you end up with, let's go ahead and come into a basic level here, is that when you're trying to do moonlighting, you need to really, really drop down the intensity. And then you're usually dealing with a darker exposure value, and you're relying pretty heavily on something like your skylight to fill out the scenes here. But the approach that I actually opted for in this scene was to go a little bit stylized with my moonlight here. And I wanted to actually crank my lighting up a little bit. So normally it would be something a little bit more like this. Sometimes, I've seen people go up to about 3 when they're trying to do some bright moonlight through here. And we're really heavily relying on the skylight. So if I take my skylight away, you can see how things start to get darker in there. So you can see with and without makes a huge difference in the light and the shadow there. But what I wanted to do with this one was I wanted to really push this. So I took my moonlight up to 40 so I could get some stylized lighting down this path right here. And then I took my exposure value down to darken the scene. So higher light value with the lower exposure to tame it a little bit. So how we did that was in the post-process volume, you come over here to the exposure section. I see my exposure compensation is at negative 2.75. Now default would be this. So we have something like this at the default exposure with a cranked up directional light to 40. It gets pretty crazy like this already. When you're exposure locked, you can see how my min and max EV values are at 0. So if you take this down to say -1, if we were using a normal color for the sun, this would be more of a daytime kind of scene. But I took my exposure down to help darken the scene. And this is all really heavily based off of, photography-based values, working with exposure values and what kinds of exposures you would use during the day versus at night. But basically, highlight value, lower exposure. Now, you'll see that I'm also using auto exposure on here still. And normally for still image scenes, a lot of people will go in and they'll do manual exposure, which opens you up to come in here to your camera settings. And you will actually set all of your camera values like your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. But the reason I'm using auto exposure here and locking my auto exposure to 0 and then using exposure compensation to modify my exposure value is because I wanted to leave the settings like the ISO and the aperture and all that to my actual camera that I was using. And so my scene itself, I wanted to look a certain way if I were to run through it or play through it, but then also, look the same way if it was looking through the camera. So that's why I decided to stay with the auto exposure here. So now what we did with our directional light to get this moonlight, we have a high intensity on it, higher than normal, but I did a light color. Now, I usually like to do temperature, but I wanted to push it in a very specific direction. So I actually used a color on this one to get the right kind of blue that I was going for. But then we look at this up here, and you might ask, what do I have going on for my moon? Well, that's my actual directional light. So if I were to rotate this, you see that it actually rotates that whole thing. Now, how did it get so big? Well, you control the size of your what's called sun disk through the source angle here. So if I reset this to default, you'll see this just little bright sun in the distance. And I think it's something like 0.75-ish that it's normally at when you start a new scene. So if you start to take this value up, you can see that it actually gets bigger. And so I'd actually started with a moon size of something a little bit more like this. But then I decided, you know what? I want this to be a large moon. I want it to be very overarching, very intimidating moon. So I set my source angle to 12, and that's how I got this really big, soft circle there for my moon. Then if I come down here to my skylight, I'm actually using an HDRI instead of using my capture here. So our skylight, we just set source type to specified cube map, and then we can feed one of these in, which I have this one right here, which I got from polyhaven.com. And what we do is we just download that HDR, we bring it in here, and we assign it to our cube map. Then another thing that I did was I cranked my intensity scale of the skylight up to 5. So if I drop it down to the normal, the 1 right here, you can see that really starts to darken some of those shadows a little bit. I crank it up to 5, and it helps level that out. So, and then of course, the next thing I did was I've got these stars up here. Now, how I did this was I came down to my sky sphere and I created my own sky dome material for it rather than using the default one there. If I open this up, you can see that I've got this material instance. Let's go into the material, and the default, I believe, is just these nodes right here feeding into emissive color. What I did was I added on to that this tiling star texture with a multiply here for controlling the star brightness, so I can make them brighter if I wanted to. And an important thing here is this is actually using coordinate index 1 for the UVs, and the reason for that, if we go into the sky sphere that Unreal gives us right here, and we look at the UVs, this is our UV channel 0, and our UV channel 1 is laid out like that, which this just ends up working a little bit better with my particular star texture that I have. Which, where did I get that from? You can actually find that in your engine folder. So if I bring this in here, we're going to go to our engine content, which you can't see right here. Close that, but we can see it right here. And how you get to that if you don't see it is your settings over here. There is a checkbox for show engine content. You just make sure this is checked, and you'll see your engine folder. So I just came in here to engine. I searched stars, and look what I found. I found these textures right here for stars. I believe they're the same texture in different folders. So I just copy this over to my own folder to use. So then next, what I did after setting that up, we're going to come down here to our sky atmosphere. And the main thing that I changed with this was I came into my Rayleigh scattering and adjusted the color a little bit, because this color drives how the particles disperse through the air. So I come in here, and you can see if I start to change these, it's a very subtle effect because I have all my fog and stuff layered on top of it, but it did give me my baseline for what I was doing there. But like I said, the fog was a very important part. I'm going to come in here to the fog. And what we're going to see here is the first thing that I did was I really cranked up the density. So the default is like 0.02 and a fog height fall off of 0.2. So this is our default height fog here. I just crank that up to 1, really get it going. You'll see how it really floods the scene. So I use my height fall off to drive it down. I believe I took it up to, yeah, 0.6 right there. So it kind of pushes that fog down and makes it thicker down there. And of course, I have this second fog data that I turned on. So that allows you to just add another layer to it. I changed my fog in scattering color to this kind of purple. You can see that if I change it to more of a yellowish here, you can see that yellow showing up in the background there. Red kind of gets red through there. And then, blue, it just starts to bleed into everything. Green, you can see it more. But I use this purple color to just give that kind of background to the fog. Then, of course, we are using volumetric fog. So with volumetric fog off, this is what we get. You can really see that in scattering color there. But with it on, we get all this extra stuff. And for this, I did drive up my scattering distribution. So if I were to drop this all the way down, you can see what that does. I start bringing this up some, can make it all kinds of crazy. And I think I settled somewhere around 5.7. And then I did change my albedo and my emissive colors. So the albedo here, this one is controlling the base color of the fog. It's really strong, whatever you set this to. Whatever you set this color to is what it's going to really show up as. So I went with this kind of light blue to give me that nighttime moonlight sense. And then we have our emissive here, which the emissive by default is set to black, which doesn't give us anything at all. But you start cranking the emissive and you can see how it feeds some light into this. So if I were to do something like this magenta here, you can see that my albedo of the fog is still that blue, but it's also emanating this magenta light. So you can really mess with things going on here. But what I tried to do was I tried to align them a little bit in color so that I could really drive that color of the atmosphere. So then with all of that, of course, we're in here, we're on our post-processing. And in my post-processing, we did already look at the exposure. So I decided on negative 2.75 for my exposure compensation. And that was based off of the 40 lux of my moonlight here. So I went back and forth on this. I think my initial values were like 8 for the moonlight, and then my exposure compensation was like -1, something like that. And so I played with these values a lot until I got the ones that I just really liked and they just clicked for me. There is no math to it. There's really not, depending upon how your scene is set up and what you're going for, you just gotta play those values by eye. But of course, when you're using auto exposure, if you set your min and max to the same number, it's going to lock it. And so that's what I did here. And I decided on 0 so I could play around with my exposure compensation. But usually, like if you were doing a daytime, you want to just be, at an EV15, you would actually set these two to 0 and you would set these two to 15 and you would set your exposure compensation to 0, that sort of thing. This time I let these be 0 so I could drive it with my exposure compensation. Then of course we come down here into our color grading section, and I did do a little bit of basic color grading. I desaturated the scene just ever so slightly. I bumped the contrast up just ever so slightly, and I also bumped the gain up ever so slightly. So without these things, that would have been my raw scene there. So my desat just takes it down a little bit, just takes a little bit of that bite out of it. But then when I drove my contrast, I really started to get what I wanted with the moonlight versus the darkness, but it did darken the overall scene. So I added a little bit back in with the gain. So now, of course, I had to set up my camera, which is this guy right here. This is actually a Cine camera, and you can see what it is seeing right there. And in this camera, I am using a film back of 16:9 DSLR. The default in here is 16:9 digital film, which you can see has you zoomed in quite a bit right here, which is actually close to what my original composition was before I started playing with it more. But the 16:9 DSLR is essentially going to give you a full frame DSLR with that 16:9 film crop. So we'll set that there. I'm using a manual focus method, as you can see on this. Of course, remember, we can always draw our debug focus plane to see where it is. And I've got it right about here, right in the middle of this, because I wasn't trying to focus any crazy bokeh or anything like that. I was going with an aperture of f4, so it was still pretty low, and it gets a little bit of bokeh in there as it gets really far off in the back. But I did want things to be as crisp as possible because it is a kind of a wider shot, which on my full frame here, I'm using a focal length of 30 millimeter. And then of course, in terms of the exposure value and everything like that, I'm allowing that to be driven by the post-process volume. So I'm not doing anything with that on the camera here. So then of course, in here, with this, my viewport, I do have this set up to be a cinematic viewport. So I come up here to perspective, we come all the way down here to viewport type, and we can set it to cinematic viewport. It's going to give you these black bars right here. That's going to tell me no active level sequence editor detected, because I'm not doing any sequence stuff with this. I'm not doing any actual camera movements or animation. I'm just trying to do a still image here. But the most important thing with this is if we come up here, we have this little box right here. These are our composition tools. So if I click on this, we can use the composition tools in here. We can use our action safe and our title safe frames if we want. We can add a letterbox to it if we want to go for a specific letterbox. And of course, we have our composition overlays, which I love working with the rule of thirds here. We just set this grid 3x3 and you get your rule of thirds. And then you can just move your camera around and figure out what you want. So if I come into my Cine Camera Actor here and I turn my game view on, we can see how this is laid out. And I have my composition set up to where this is going right through the middle, this path is, and I have my bottom rule of thirds line lined up perfectly with my horizon over there. And if I were to jump over into an experimental camera, which I may or may not continue on and do something with, I was trying to do a setup that was looking directly at this particular hero tombstone here. And so I have that on this thirds line, and that was made easy because of these composition tools. So then, of course, to finish it off, what we do in here is I have 4K monitors. And you can see that even if I go full screen on this, I don't have the full 4K taken up right here. So what I usually do is I come in here and to the hamburger menu, I come down to high resolution screenshot, and I will actually pump this up to 2, which is going to render it at double the size of what we're looking at here, which is going to give me enough so that when I down-res it to 4K, it's going to be nice and crisp. Also, what's really great is that the screen percentage, which is one of the things that Unreal uses to help capture these graphics, is basically rendering this 4K image at 1788 by 1007. My screen percentage is 52, and that means it's basically doubling the size to get that 4K. So when I double the size of this, I'm actually getting a render out there at that resolution. So my result, even when I down-res it to the 4K that I'm going to down-res it to, is going to be nice and crisp, as if my screen resolution was 100% without actually setting it to that and crashing my editor. But of course, I did do a little bit of Photoshop trickery to get that final image. Nothing crazy, nothing trying to fake it or lie or anything like that. Just a few enhancements to make that final image a little bit prettier. What I did was I took my base and this, I down-res it from the almost 8K that it was down to an actual 4K here, where I got my nice crisp image as if it was rendered at 4K. And then I just did some levels adjustment on it. So very slight. So going from this to this, very slight adjustments on there. That gave it a nice little bit of contrast. And then what I did was I added a desaturation layer to it. So this is a very, very subtle 30% overlay onto this, which I just took my toned copy and just completely desaturated it, Control-Shift-U if you're using Photoshop. And then I added this mask so that it's only desaturating the outside of this and it's leaving the inside fully saturated on here. And then we're just doing a 30% overlay on that. Then what I did was I duplicated my tone copy again to brighten it up a little bit to add some brightness to the moon area here. And I did an opposite kind of mask to what I did with my desaturation so that the bright moon is only focused on this area. So my desaturation is only focused on these outer edges and my bright moon is only focused on this inner part here. So then after I did that, I took my image and I put it here in my pure ref right up next to my reference images. I looked at it, I compared it, I criticized it. I personally didn't think it reached the same level of quality as these, but it was one of my 5-day challenges. So I rushed through everything and everything as quickly as I could. And I was happy with the result. Could it be better? Yes, it could. I could definitely spend more time on this to get it to a better point, which beyond this one here, now that I look at it, I actually did. Let's grab this one here because I did do an update to it. I added the leaves in. Let's add this in and let's crunch this down. I'll bring it over here. There we go. We'll put this one. I'm going to move this. We'll move this. Put that one beside it. Yeah, after those edits that I did, I do feel like it reaches it even closer, and I'm happy with that. But of course, we can see how those last minute edits of where I added the leaves and I did a little bit of the Photoshop touch-up work, how it took it from this, and to me, that just makes the difference. But all in all, it was a very fun project, and I look forward to doing all of the breakdown videos for my Learn Digital Alchemy students.